There is a continent beneath the Pacific Ocean. Not a seamount, not a submarine plateau, not a geological curiosity of interest only to specialists. A continent, a discrete mass of continental crust, with the full geological identity that the word implies. Granitic rocks, a crust significantly thicker than the surrounding oceanic floor, a geological history of its own distinct from the surrounding ocean basin, and the full complement of continental features: mountains, valleys, plains, and the ancient root structures that mark a land that was once above the surface of the sea. A continent roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent, sitting beneath the southwestern Pacific Ocean, its highest peaks just breaking the surface as the islands we call New Zealand and New Caledonia, the rest of it, 94% of its total area, hidden beneath the waves. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel to the places where the record turns out to be wrong, where the map we thought we understood contains something that was hidden, waiting to be found. The continent is called Zealandia, and its formal recognition by the geological community in 2017, after decades of debate and accumulating evidence, was one of the most remarkable scientific announcements of recent years. Not because the existence of submerged continental crust beneath the southwestern Pacific was unknown before 2017. Geologists had been studying the region for decades and the data had been accumulating in the literature for years, but because the synthesis of that data into a formal claim that Zealandia met all the criteria to be classified as a continent, rather than merely an unusually thick piece of oceanic or transitional crust, required the kind of comprehensive, multi-parameter analysis that the 2017 paper by Nick Mortimer and colleagues provided. They were not discovering something new. They were recognizing something that had always been there, that had been partially visible for decades, but that had never been assembled into a coherent picture of continental identity. The implications of that recognition extend in several directions. Geologically, the confirmation of Zealandia as a continent changes our understanding of the breakup of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana and of the tectonic processes that have shaped the southwestern Pacific over the past 80 million years. Biologically, it reframes the question of how the unique species of New Zealand and New Caledonia came to be where they are, whether they evolved in isolation on a drowned continent or arrived by long-distance dispersal to islands that had always been islands. And philosophically, it raises a question that is more unsettling than it might initially appear. If an entire continent, the eighth continent on Earth, could be hidden beneath the ocean for so long that the scientific community only formally recognized it in the 21st century, what does that say about the limits of our knowledge of the world we inhabit? The size of Zealandia puts this question in proper perspective. At approximately 5 million square kilometers, Zealandia is roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent, larger than Greenland, larger than the Arabian Peninsula, comparable in area to the European Union. This is not a small geological feature. It is not a plateau or a ridge or an underwater mountain range. It is a continent-sized piece of continental crust that has been sitting beneath the southwestern Pacific for tens of millions of years, mapped in fragments and studied in pieces by generations of geologists, and only assembled into a coherent picture of continental identity in the 21st century. The scale of what was hidden is part of what makes the discovery so remarkable. We did not miss a small thing. We missed something the size of India. The story of how we missed it, and how we finally recognized it, is a story about the nature of scientific knowledge, about the way that existing conceptual frameworks shape what we are able to see, and about the surprising persistence of gaps in our understanding of a planet that we have been studying systematically for over 2 centuries. It is also a story about the ocean, about how much of the Earth's history is hidden beneath the surface of the sea, accessible only through the indirect methods of oceanography and marine geology, and about what those methods have revealed and are still revealing about the world beneath the waves. The scale of the ocean's coverage of the Earth is worth pausing on. The ocean covers approximately 71% of the Earth's surface, nearly 3/4 of the planet. The land that is above water, the land we walk on and build on and study directly, is less than a third of the total surface. Everything else, the continental shelves, the deep abyssal plains, the mid-ocean ridges, the submerged plateaus and seamounts and trenches, is hidden beneath water, accessible only through the indirect and expensive methods of oceanography. The world we live in is mostly ocean, and the ocean floor is mostly unknown. Zealandia is a reminder of that fundamental fact about the planet we inhabit, that the world we can see is the minority of the world that exists. To understand Zealandia, it is necessary to understand the ancient world from which it came, the supercontinent of Gondwana, whose fragmentation over hundreds of millions of years created the southern hemisphere as we know it. Gondwana was one of the two great landmasses into which the even older supercontinent Pangaea divided approximately 180 million years ago. It contained what would eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and, crucially for this story, the landmass that would become Zealandia. At the time of Gondwana's existence, the world looked almost nothing like it does today. The Atlantic Ocean did not exist. Antarctica was not at the South Pole and was not covered in ice. India was not attached to Asia. Australia was connected to Antarctica. And the great landmass that would become Zealandia was attached to the eastern margin of what is now Australia and Antarctica, forming the southeastern portion of the Gondwanan supercontinent. The breakup of Gondwana was not a single event but a prolonged process, occurring in stages over tens of millions of years as different components of the supercontinent separated and drifted away from each other. The key separation for Zealandia's story occurred approximately 85 million years ago, when the Proto-Zealandia landmass rifted away from the eastern margin of Australia and began its independent drift across the Pacific. At this point, Zealandia was a substantial landmass, perhaps comparable in area to Australia itself, or somewhat smaller, and it sat at the surface of the ocean, with its own climate, its own rivers, its own vegetation, and presumably its own fauna, though the evidence for what lived on Zealandia before it submerged is extremely sparse. The process by which Zealandia subsequently drowned is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the geological history of the southern hemisphere. As the landmass rifted away from Australia and the oceanic crust around it cooled and contracted, the edges of the Zealandian continent began to thin and subside. The rifting process stretched the continental crust, pulling it apart and making it thinner, and thinner continental crust, like a raft that has had some of its material removed, floats lower in the underlying mantle and sits closer to the ocean surface. Over tens of millions of years, the thinning and subsidence of the Zealandian continental crust lowered the land below sea level, until only the highest portions, the mountains that would become the New Zealand Southern Alps and the ranges of New Caledonia, remained above water. The continent did not disappear into the ocean. It gradually sank as the geological processes that had created it were reversed by the dynamics of plate tectonics acting on a thinned and stretched continental margin. The analogy that geologists often use to explain continental submergence is that of an iceberg. Continental crust, being less dense than the underlying mantle, floats on it in the same way that ice floats on water. A thick piece of continental crust floats high, with most of its volume above the waterline. A thin piece of continental crust floats low, with much of its volume submerged. As the rifting process stretched and thinned the Zealandian crust, it was as if material was being removed from the top of the iceberg. The crust became less buoyant and sank lower in the mantle, and the surface of the continent dropped toward and then below sea level. The imagery is imperfect, the geological reality is more complex, but the basic principle is correct. The fate of Zealandia was determined by the density and thickness of its crust, and both of those properties were changed by the rifting process that separated the continent from its neighbors. The rate of the sinking was slow by human standards, but rapid by geological ones. The initial rifting from Australia began approximately 85 million years ago and was largely complete by approximately 55 million years ago, a period of 30 million years during which the continent gradually lost most of its above-water territory. The timing of this submergence coincides with a period of globally elevated sea levels associated with the warm climate of the early Cenozoic, the Eocene epoch, when temperatures were high enough that there were no polar ice caps and the global sea level was perhaps 70 to 80 meters higher than today. The combination of a sinking continent and a rising global sea level accelerated the submergence of the Zealandian lowlands, producing a rapid loss of above-water territory that the geological and biological record on the above-water remnants partially captures. The question of whether the submergence was ever complete, whether all of Zealandia was ever simultaneously beneath the ocean, is one of the most important and most contested questions in Zealandian geology. A period of complete submergence would have profound implications for the biogeography of New Zealand and New Caledonia. If there was no land above the surface, then all of the current species must have arrived by over-water dispersal after the re-emergence of the landmass. If parts of the continent remained above water even during the period of maximum submergence, then some species could have survived in refugia and evolved in place. The answer matters not just for understanding the history of life in the region, but for understanding the dynamics of continental submergence as a geological process, of how thin a piece of continental crust can become and still remain, at least in part, above the sea surface. The evidence that Zealandia is a genuine continent rather than merely a thick piece of oceanic or transitional crust comes from multiple lines of geological investigation, each independently pointing to the same conclusion. The most fundamental requirement for continental status is the right kind of rock. Continental crust is composed primarily of granitic and metamorphic rocks, the light-colored, silica-rich crystalline rocks that form the cores of the Great Mountain Ranges and that are fundamentally different in composition from the dark, heavy basaltic rocks of the oceanic floor. When geologists analyze the rocks dredged from the seafloor of the Zealandian region, they find exactly this: the granites, the schists, the gneisses, and the other crystalline metamorphic rocks that are the diagnostic signature of continental crust. These rocks are not confined to the portions of Zealandia that are above water. They are distributed across the submerged portions as well, confirming that the underwater plateau is not a volcanic construct sitting on oceanic crust but a genuine piece of the ancient continental jigsaw. The second line of evidence is the thickness of the crust. Continental crust is typically between 30 and 50 kilometers thick, compared to the 5 to 10 kilometers of oceanic crust. Seismic surveys of the Zealandian region, studies that use the behavior of earthquake waves traveling through the crust to map its thickness and internal structure, show crustal thicknesses consistent with continental rather than oceanic crust across most of the submerged plateau. The crust is thinner than in the above-water portions of Zealandia, which is consistent with the thinning and stretching that caused the continent to subside, but it is still substantially thicker than oceanic crust. The seismic data provides a three-dimensional picture of a continuous crustal body with the internal architecture of a continent. The third line of evidence is the elevation of the seafloor itself. Continental crust, being lighter than oceanic crust, floats higher on the underlying mantle. The seafloor over the Zealandian plateau is significantly shallower than the surrounding oceanic abyssal plains. It sits at depths of around 1 to 3 kilometers rather than the 4 to 6 kilometers typical of deep ocean floor. The elevated seafloor is consistent with the presence of buoyant continental crust beneath it, and the pattern of depth variation across the plateau corresponds to the expected pattern of a thinned continental crust that has subsided to just below sea level rather than the pattern of oceanic crust of varying age. Taken together, the rock types, the crustal thickness, the elevation, and the geological history, the evidence for Zealandia's continental status is compelling and consistent across multiple independent methods of investigation. The question of why this evidence was not synthesized into a formal claim of continental status earlier in the history of the earth sciences is partly an organizational one and partly a conceptual one. Organizationally, The different types of evidence were collected by different research communities: marine geologists, geophysicists, stratigraphers, paleontologists, working in different institutional contexts and publishing in different journals. The synthesis required someone to read across all of these literatures and recognize that the cumulative evidence exceeded what any single discipline had assembled. Conceptually, the existing framework for the continental geology of the southwestern Pacific, which recognized two continents, Australia and Antarctica, and treated everything else in the region as oceanic or transitional, was sufficiently established that evidence inconsistent with it tended to be explained away rather than used to challenge the framework. The 2017 paper that formally made the case for Zealandian continental status was authored by a large collaborative team of geologists from New Zealand, Australia, France, and other countries. A collaboration that was itself part of what made the synthesis possible, because it brought together the different communities of researchers whose work bore on the question and created a forum in which the cumulative evidence could be assembled and evaluated. The paper was published in the journal GSA Today, the newsletter of the Geological Society of America, and it attracted attention both within the geological community and in the broader public, partly because the claim was striking, and partly because the story of a hidden continent had a quality of discovery that resonated with people who had not previously thought much about the geological classification of the ocean floor. The response within the geological community was not unanimous. Some geologists argued that the criteria applied to Zealandia were inconsistently strict, that if Zealandia qualifies as a continent, then other pieces of submerged continental crust around the world should also be reclassified. Others argued that the threshold for continental status should be revised to exclude features that are almost entirely submerged, on the grounds that the cultural and practical utility of the concept of continent depends on it referring to above-water landmasses. The debate reflects genuine uncertainty about whether the concept of continent, which has both geological and cultural dimensions, can be defined in a way that is simultaneously scientifically rigorous and intuitively meaningful. The biological legacy of Zealandia, the question of what lived on the continent before it submerged, and how the unique species of New Zealand and New Caledonia relate to what was there before the drowning, is one of the most fascinating and most actively debated questions in the biogeography of the Southern Hemisphere. New Zealand is famous among biologists for its extraordinary endemic species, the flightless birds that fill ecological niches occupied by mammals elsewhere, the tuatara that is the sole surviving member of an order of reptiles that was diverse and widespread in the Mesozoic era, the ancient trees and plants that represent lineages with no close relatives anywhere else in the world. This biological distinctiveness has always required explanation, and the explanation that has been most widely accepted is the extreme isolation of the New Zealand landmass, isolated from all other continental landmasses for so long, and with so few opportunities for colonization by mainland species, that its ancestral fauna and flora evolved in a bubble, producing the unique assemblage that the first human settlers found when they arrived approximately 700 years ago. The question of how the ancestral species got there is where Zealandia's geological history becomes critically important. The traditional view was that New Zealand's ancestors dispersed across the ocean, that the ancestors of the tuatara and the moa and the kiwi and the ancient plants arrived in New Zealand by long-distance dispersal, crossing hundreds of kilometers of open ocean by wind or water or by rafting on floating vegetation. This view was supported by the geological evidence for the complete submergence of Zealandia in the mid-Cenozoic, a period approximately 23 million years ago, during which the sea level was high enough and the Zealandian crust had subsided far enough that the entire landmass, including what is now New Zealand, may have been beneath the surface of the ocean. If Zealandia was completely submerged for several million years, then its modern species cannot have evolved in place. They must have colonized the re-emergent landmass from elsewhere. But not all biologists accept the complete submergence hypothesis, and the alternative view, that parts of the Zealandian crust remained above water even during the period of maximum submergence, providing refuges from which the surviving lineages could have recolonized the emergent landmass, has been gaining support as the geological and biological evidence has been re-examined. The debate is directly relevant to our understanding of how life colonizes and diversifies in isolated environments, and its resolution will depend on a combination of detailed geological mapping of the submerged portions of Zealandia and molecular phylogenetic analysis of the species whose origins are in question. The molecular clock approach to biogeographic questions, using the rate of molecular evolution to estimate when two lineages diverged from a common ancestor, has been applied to many of the distinctive species of New Zealand, and the results have been mixed. Some lineages show divergence times that are consistent with the Gondwanan origin hypothesis. They diverged from their nearest relatives on other Gondwanan fragments tens of millions of years ago, at times consistent with the separation of Zealandia from Australia and Antarctica. Others show much more recent divergence times, consistent with dispersal across the ocean within the past few million years. The molecular data suggest that the modern biota of New Zealand is a mixture of ancient Gondwanan relicts and more recent colonists, which is consistent with either the complete or the partial submergence hypothesis. Ancient relicts could have survived on refugia during partial submergence, while recent colonists could have arrived by overwater dispersal after re-emergence. The kiwi, perhaps the most iconic of New Zealand's distinctive birds, is an instructive case. The kiwis and their ratite relatives, the moa, were for a long time assumed to be Gondwanan relicts, descended from ancestors that were present on Zealandia when it separated from Australia 85 million years ago. But molecular phylogenetic studies have consistently found that the closest relatives of the kiwis are not the moa or the other ratites of the southern hemisphere, but the elephant birds of Madagascar, a finding that is very difficult to reconcile with a Gondwanan origin. The most widely accepted current interpretation is that the kiwi ancestors arrived in New Zealand by overwater dispersal from somewhere in the eastern African or Malagasy region, perhaps within the past 30 to 40 million years, rather than being Gondwanan relicts. The kiwi, in other words, is not an ancient inheritance from the continent's Gondwanan past. It is a relatively recent immigrant whose ancestors crossed a vast ocean to reach an isolated archipelago. The tuatara remains a more compelling candidate for Gondwanan relict status. Its order, the Rhynchocephalia, was diverse and widespread during the Mesozoic. Fossils of rhynchocephalian reptiles have been found on every continent, but all lineages except the tuatara were apparently eliminated by competition with lizards and other reptiles during the Cenozoic. That the tuatara survived while all its relatives disappeared points strongly to the protective isolation of the Zealandian landmass as the key factor, and its phylogenetic position at the base of a lineage that was diverse in the Mesozoic suggests a very deep history in the region. The geological structure of Zealandia is dominated by the boundary between two of Earth's major tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the Australian Plate, which runs directly through the region and which has been the site of intense geological activity for the past 25 million years. The boundary between the Pacific and Australian plates in the New Zealand region is a transform fault in the north, where the plates slide past each other horizontally, and a subduction zone in the south, where the Pacific Plate is diving beneath the Australian Plate at the Hikurangi Trough. This complex plate boundary has produced the dramatic topography of the New Zealand Islands. The Southern Alps, which rise to over 3,000 meters above sea level and are among the most rapidly uplifting mountain ranges in the world, are the direct result of the compression and uplift caused by the convergence of the two plates. The mountains are rising at rates of several millimeters per year, fast enough to be detectable by modern geodetic measurements, and they are being eroded at comparable rates by the intense rainfall driven by the westerly winds that cross the Tasman Sea. The plate boundary is also the source of the earthquakes and volcanic activity that make New Zealand one of the most geologically active regions in the world. The earthquakes of Christchurch in 2010 and 2011, which killed hundreds of people and devastated the city centre, were generated by faults associated with the plate boundary system that runs through the South Island. The volcanoes of the Taupo volcanic zone in the North Island, including the supervolcano beneath Lake Taupo, which produced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the past 100,000 years, approximately 1,800 years ago, are fueled by the subduction of the Pacific Plate beneath the Australian Plate, which generates the magma that feeds the volcanic system. The geological activity that makes New Zealand so dramatically topographically dynamic is also part of the reason why the question of Zealandia's submergence history is difficult to resolve. The intense deformation associated with the plate boundary has disrupted and obscured the geological record in the New Zealand islands, making it difficult to determine what the land surface looked like during periods of geological history more than a few million years ago. The submerged portions of Zealandia, away from the most intense deformation, may actually preserve a clearer geological record of the continent's history than the above-water portions, a paradox that makes the mapping and sampling of the underwater plateau one of the most important priorities in Zealandian geology. The plate boundary dynamics of the Zealandian region have also generated some of the most dramatic geological events in the history of the continent. The Taupo eruption of approximately 232 CE, possibly one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 5,000 years, ejected an enormous volume of magma and volcanic material and produced a caldera lake that is now the largest lake in New Zealand. The eruption was witnessed by the Romans from the other side of the world. Classical sources describe a reddish glow in the sky at around this time that has been interpreted as the atmospheric effect of the Taupo eruption's massive injection of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. New Zealand, in other words, once produced an eruption large enough to be noticed on the other side of the planet. The seismic hazard of the Zealandian region is a defining feature of life in New Zealand and a continuous reminder of the geological activity that underlies the familiar landscape. The Alpine Fault that runs for most of the length of the South Island is one of the longest and most active strike-slip faults in the world, and it ruptures in magnitude 8 earthquakes at intervals of approximately 300 years. The most recent major rupture on the Alpine Fault occurred in approximately 1717 CE, which means that a major rupture is overdue by historical standards, a fact that New Zealand geologists and emergency management agencies take seriously. The ongoing collision of the Pacific and Australian plates that creates this seismic hazard is also what is keeping the above-water portions of Zealandia above water. Without the continuing compression and uplift driven by the plate convergence, the Southern Alps would rapidly erode to sea level and New Zealand would rejoin the rest of the continent beneath the waves. The relationship between erosion and tectonics in the Southern Alps is one of the most intensively studied examples of the feedback between geological processes and surface processes anywhere on Earth. The mountains are rising at rates that would produce, over 1 million years, a range far taller than the current Southern Alps, but the rainfall driven against the western slopes of the range by the prevailing westerly winds is eroding the mountains at rates that almost exactly balance the tectonic uplift, keeping the mountain heights approximately stable over geological time. The erosion products, the sand and gravel and silt stripped from the mountains by the rivers, are transported to the coast and deposited on the continental shelf, adding to the sediment that covers the submerged portions of Zealandia. The mountains are continuously building and continuously eroding, and the material stripped from the peaks is gradually accumulating on the floor of the drowned continent beneath them. The Maori people of New Zealand, the indigenous Polynesian culture that settled the islands approximately 700 years ago, have a cosmological and cultural framework that describes the land of New Zealand in terms that carry a resonance with the geological history of Zealandia that is worth reflecting on. In Maori cosmology, the islands of New Zealand, Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, were fished up from the sea by the demigod Maui, who used a magical fishhook and the power of karakia, sacred chant, to draw the land up from the depths of the ocean. The North Island is called Te Ikaea Maui, the fish of Maui, and the South Island is called Te Wakara Maui, the canoe of Maui. The story describes the land as something that came from beneath the sea, as something that was drawn upward from the ocean depths to become habitable land. This is, in its essentials, a metaphorical description of a geological process that is not entirely unlike what the geological record actually shows. a submerged landmass whose highest portions re-emerged above sea level as the tectonic forces that had depressed it were partially reversed, and whose continued emergence is driven by the ongoing geological activity of one of the most tectonically active regions in the world. It would be inappropriate to claim that the Maori tradition encodes specific scientific knowledge about the geological history of Zealandia. The timescales involved are far beyond the scope of oral tradition, and the specific mechanisms are entirely different from the metaphorical description in the myth. But the basic image of land drawn up from beneath the ocean, of the earth and the sea in a dynamic relationship in which what was below can become what is above, resonates with the geological reality in a way that is at minimum poetically appropriate and at most suggestive of a deep cultural intuition about the unstable relationship between land and sea in this part of the world. The Maori navigational tradition is one of the most sophisticated in the Pacific, a tradition that allowed the settlement of the most remote corner of the Polynesian Triangle, the islands of Aotearoa, using the same techniques of celestial navigation, wave piloting, and ecological reading that had allowed the colonization of Hawaii and Easter Island and the rest of the Pacific archipelago. The wayfinders who made these voyages read the ocean as fluently as a modern navigator reads a chart. They knew the stars that rose and set in the direction of their destination, the currents that would carry them there, the clouds and birds and sea life that signaled the presence of land over the horizon. This knowledge was not written down. It was encoded in chant and practice and carried in the minds and bodies of the navigators who trained for years to master it. It was, in its own way, a complete geographical knowledge of the Pacific, not the geologist's knowledge of crustal types and tectonic boundaries, but the navigator's knowledge of routes and signs and seasonal patterns that allowed movement across the largest ocean in the world. The first settlers arrived in New Zealand approximately 700 years ago, crossing from eastern Polynesia in double-hulled voyaging canoes, and they brought with them the navigational knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of Pacific voyaging. That knowledge was embedded in the cultural traditions of the communities that maintained it, in the chants that encoded star paths and seasonal wind patterns, in the oral maps that described the geographical relationships between distant islands, in the practical skills of reading the ocean that were transmitted from master navigators to their apprentices over generations. The arrival of the first Maori in New Zealand was the last great act of human geographical discovery, the settlement of the last large landmass to be inhabited by human beings, completing the project of dispersal across the globe that had begun when our ancestors left Africa over 100,000 years earlier. The people who made that final journey into the unknown Southern Ocean were the culmination of a process that had taken our species to every corner of the habitable Earth, and their arrival in Aotearoa, finding the islands that rose from the sea, naming the mountains and the rivers, learning the rhythms of the seasons and the resources of the land, was the last chapter in the story of human first contact with the natural world. The geological processes that produced the above-water portions of Zealandia made that final discovery possible. Without the mountains that remained above the waves, there would have been no islands for the navigators to find. The Maori experience of the land of New Zealand as a dynamic, geologically active environment is embedded throughout their culture, in their knowledge of the volcanic and earthquake activity of the region, in their use of geothermal resources, in their understanding of the relationship between the land and the sea that is expressed in their maritime tradition and their ecological knowledge. The first humans to inhabit Aotearoa arrived in a landscape that was still being shaped by the geological processes that have continued to the present, and their cultural framework for understanding that landscape reflects a 700-year engagement with one of the most geologically dynamic environments on Earth. The exploration of the submerged portions of Zealandia is one of the most ambitious and most technically demanding scientific projects currently underway in the southwestern Pacific, and the results it is producing are transforming our understanding of the continent's history and structure. The primary tool for mapping the submerged terrain of Zealandia is multi-beam sonar, the same technology that has revolutionized our understanding of the global ocean floor over the past 3 decades. Multi-beam sonar systems mounted on research vessels emit fan-shaped arrays of acoustic pulses that spread out beneath the ship, measuring the depth of the seafloor across a wide swath and building up, as the ship moves, a continuous three-dimensional map of the terrain below. Applied to Zealandia, these surveys have revealed a landscape of extraordinary geological complexity. The submarine ridges and basins, the ancient volcanic constructs, the fault scarps and sediment fans, and the relict valleys and plains of a continent that was above the ocean surface for tens of millions of years before it drowned. The underwater terrain of Zealandia contains features that are clearly the relict landscape of a drowned continent, features that do not form on the seafloor through submarine processes, but that are the preserved signatures of continental processes that operated when the land was above water. Submarine canyons that were clearly cut by rivers during periods of low sea level. Sediment fans at the mouths of those ancient river systems, built up over millions of years of continental erosion. Flat-topped underwater peaks called geos, seamounts that were once islands, their tops planed flat by wave erosion at sea level before they subsided to their current depths. The submerged terrain of Zealandia is not just the bottom of the ocean. It is the floor of a drowned world, preserving in its topography the memory of a landscape that no longer exists above the waves. The sediment cores that researchers are extracting from the floor of the Zealandian seas are a particularly valuable archive. Deep-sea sediment accumulates slowly, layer by layer, over millions of years, and the successive layers preserve a record of the environmental conditions, the water temperature, the biological productivity, the presence of terrestrial pollen and organic material, at the time of their deposition. Cores that contain freshwater pollen and terrestrial plant material at certain depths tell us that there was land nearby when those layers were deposited, that the sea floor where the sediment was collected was within wind or current range of a terrestrial environment. Cores that contain only marine microfossils tell us that the area was open ocean. By dating the layers and tracking the transition from terrestrial to marine conditions in the sediment record, researchers can reconstruct the history of Zealandia's submergence with increasing precision. The research vessels that conduct these surveys in the Zealandian region operate in some of the most remote and most challenging ocean conditions in the world. The Southern Ocean, which forms the southern boundary of the Zealandian region, is notorious for its storms and rough seas, and research cruises in the area require ships and crews capable of operating in severe conditions for extended periods. The logistical challenges of working in this environment, the distance from port, the weather-related delays, the mechanical demands on the ship and its equipment, are part of what has made the systematic study of Zealandia slower and more expensive than the study of more accessible geological regions. The science is advancing, but it is advancing against the practical resistance of a remote and difficult ocean environment that does not yield its secrets easily. The microfossils preserved in the sediment cores are particularly valuable for reconstructing past ocean conditions. The tiny shells of single-celled organisms called foraminifera, some of which live in the water column and sink to the seafloor when they die, others of which live on the seafloor itself, are remarkably sensitive indicators of water temperature, salinity, and nutrient availability. The oxygen isotope ratios of their shells record the temperature of the water in which they lived with a precision that modern analytical chemistry can measure, providing a temperature record of the Zealandian ocean environment going back millions of years. Changes in the species composition of the foraminiferal assemblages through a core record changes in the oceanographic conditions, warm water species replacing cold water species during periods of warming, the reverse during cooling events, that can be dated and correlated with the global record of climate change. The biological productivity of the Zealandian seas, recorded in the organic carbon content and the siliceous plankton preserved in the sediment cores, also reflects the history of the continent's submergence. During periods when the Zealandian plateau was shallower and more land was exposed, the nutrient supply to the surrounding seas was higher. Rivers carried dissolved minerals from the land into the ocean, and the shallow seafloor of the continental platform supported diverse benthic communities that contributed to biological productivity. As the continent sank deeper and less land was exposed, the nutrient supply decreased and the biological productivity changed. The record of this change, preserved in the chemistry and biology of the sediment, is one of the most direct ways of tracing the history of how much land Zealandia had above the sea surface at different points in its geological past. The question of what Zealandia looked like when it was above the ocean surface, what its climate was, what species lived on it, what its landscapes were like, can only be partially answered from the geological and biological evidence that survives its submergence. The flora of Zealandia in its subaerial phase can be partially reconstructed from the pollen preserved in the sediment cores and from the fossil plant material that has been found in the above-water portions of the continent. New Zealand and New Caledonia contain plant species that are representatives of ancient Gondwanan lineages, trees and shrubs whose closest relatives are found in Australia, South America, and Antarctica, reflecting the floristic connections of the Gondwanan supercontinent before its breakup. The southern beech forests of New Zealand, the kauri forests of the northern North Island, and the complex rainforests of New Caledonia all contain elements of a Gondwanan flora that has been evolving in isolation since the separation of Zealandia from Australia and Antarctica approximately 85 million years ago. This flora was present on the continent when it was above water, and its descendants survive today in the above-water remnants of the continent. The fauna is more difficult to reconstruct because the vertebrate fossil record of New Zealand is sparse, particularly for the pre-submergence period. The oldest well-documented New Zealand vertebrate fossils date from the Cretaceous period, approximately 70 to 80 million years ago, and they include an array of dinosaurs and other reptiles that were the dominant large animals of the time. Whether any of these lineages survived the submergence and the re-emergence of the landmass, whether there is continuity between the Cretaceous fauna of pre-submergence Zealandia and the modern fauna of New Zealand, is one of the most actively debated questions in the biogeography of the region. The tuatara, the extraordinary reptile that is the sole surviving member of the order Rhynchocephalia, which was diverse and widespread in the Mesozoic era, is the most compelling candidate for a Gondwanan relict, a lineage that has survived on the Zealandian landmass since the Mesozoic through a combination of isolation and the absence of the placental mammals that drove its relatives to extinction everywhere else. Its ancient lineage, its physiological peculiarities, and its molecular genetic relationships all suggest a very deep history in the Zealandian region. But whether it is a true Gondwanan relict or a later colonist is a question that the fossil record has not yet definitively answered. The tuatara is remarkable in ways that go beyond its evolutionary history. It has a metabolic rate lower than any other reptile, allowing it to survive in cool temperatures that would be lethal to most other reptiles. It grows extremely slowly, reaching sexual maturity at approximately 10 years of age and continuing to grow until it is 35 years old, with a lifespan that in captivity has exceeded 100 years. It has a rudimentary third eye on the top of its head, an organ with a lens, retina, and nerve connection to the brain, but which is covered by scales within a few months of hatching and is not functional as a visual organ in adults, though it may play a role in light detection for circadian rhythm regulation. These peculiarities reflect the extreme age of the tuatara lineage. Its fundamental body plan was established in the Mesozoic era and has changed remarkably little since, making it one of the most evolutionarily conservative vertebrates alive today. The conservation of the tuatara is one of the great success stories of New Zealand wildlife management. By the time European settlement of New Zealand was well established, the tuatara had been eliminated from the main islands by the rats and other predators introduced by both Maori and European settlers, and its survival was dependent on a small number of offshore islands that remained free of introduced predators. Intensive predator control programs and captive breeding have allowed the population to recover significantly, and tuatara have been reintroduced to several mainland areas within predator-proof enclosures. The tuatara that survive today are the remnants of an ancient lineage that has been in the Zealandian region for tens of millions of years, survivors of the continent's submergence, the arrival of the first human settlers, and the ecological transformation that human settlement brought. They are living fossils, but they are alive, and the effort to keep them that way is one of the most significant acts of biological conservation in the history of New Zealand. The living world of New Zealand as a whole, not just the tuatara but the entire ensemble of distinctive species, is a biological archive of the geological history of Zealandia. The species that are descended from ancient Gondwanan colonists carry in their DNA the signature of 85 million years of isolation, the genetic legacy of ancestors that were present on the continent when it first separated from Australia. The species that are more recent colonists, arrived by over-water dispersal in the past few million years, carry a different kind of signature, showing the patterns of genetic diversity that result from a small founding population colonizing a new habitat. The interaction between these ancient and recent lineages, playing out in an ecosystem that has been profoundly disturbed by human settlement and introduced species, is the subject of one of the most intensive conservation programs in the world, an effort to preserve not just individual species but the ecological relationships that the geological history of Zealandia produced. The discovery of Zealandia as a continent has implications that extend beyond the specific geology and biology of the southwestern Pacific. It is a case study in how scientific knowledge accumulates and is revised, and in how long it can take for a paradigm to shift even when the evidence is available. The data that supported the continental status of Zealandia was not collected in 2017. It had been accumulating for decades, in the work of generations of New Zealand, Australian, and international geologists and oceanographers who had been mapping and sampling the seafloor of the southwestern Pacific since the mid-20th century. The bathymetric surveys, the dredged rock samples, the seismic reflection profiles, the sediment cores, all of this data existed in the scientific literature, and much of it clearly pointed toward the conclusion that the submerged plateau west and east of New Zealand was continental rather than oceanic in character. What the 2017 paper by Mortimer and colleagues did was to synthesize this accumulated evidence into a comprehensive argument for continental status, applying the specific criteria that geologists use to classify continental crust and demonstrating that Zealandia met all of them. The reason it took so long to make this synthesis is partly a matter of disciplinary organization. The different types of data that bear on the question were collected and interpreted by different communities of researchers, and the synthesis required a perspective broad enough to integrate across those communities. It is also partly a matter of intellectual conservatism. The established classification of the southwestern Pacific as containing only two continents, Australia and Antarctica, was so firmly established that evidence inconsistent with it tended to be interpreted in ways that preserved the established view rather than challenging it. The concept of a submerged continent was available in the scientific literature for decades before it was formally argued. It was visible in the data, but the data was not forcing a revision of the classification until someone made the explicit argument. This pattern of evidence accumulating over decades before being synthesized into a paradigm shift is not unique to Zealandia. It is a common pattern in the history of science, where the existing framework of understanding shapes what questions are asked and what data is collected, and where the synthesis of existing data into a new framework often requires a specific intellectual act of combination that is not forced by any single observation. The plate tectonics revolution, the discovery of deep-sea hydrothermal vents, the recognition of mass extinction events, all followed similar patterns. Zealandia's recognition as a continent is, in this sense, a small but vivid illustration of how scientific knowledge works and why it sometimes takes much longer than it might seem necessary to recognize what is, in retrospect, obvious. The process of peer review and replication that underlies scientific knowledge accumulation is also visible in the Zealandia story. The 2017 paper was reviewed by specialists in continental geology before publication, and its claims were subject to the critical scrutiny that the peer review process provides. But peer review is not infallible. It checks the internal consistency of an argument and the quality of the evidence presented, but it cannot fully protect against errors that are systematic across the whole field, errors that arise not from bad reasoning about specific evidence but from the shared assumptions of a community of researchers. The recognition of Zealandia required not just good peer review of a specific paper but a shift in the underlying assumptions of a whole community, a shift that only happened when the evidence became too comprehensive and too consistent to be explained within the existing framework. The case of Zealandia also illustrates a more specific feature of how geographical knowledge advances: the dependence of our understanding of the ocean on the technology available for studying it. The ocean floor is inaccessible to direct observation. No one can simply walk across the Zealandian plateau and map its geology the way a geologist can walk across the Australian outback. Every piece of information about the submarine portions of Zealandia has been obtained through remote sensing techniques: sonar, seismic reflection and refraction, electromagnetic methods, or through the collection of samples by dredging, drilling, or submersible. The cost and difficulty of these methods means that the ocean floor is still, in many respects, less well understood than the surface of Mars, which can be mapped by orbiting spacecraft at a fraction of the cost of a research cruise. The recognition of Zealandia as a continent was delayed not just by the intellectual framework of the researchers, but by the practical limitations of the technology available to them. Those technological limitations are gradually being overcome. The development of autonomous underwater vehicles that can map the seafloor without a surface ship in attendance, the improvement of satellite altimetry that can detect the gravitational signature of seafloor features from space, and the expansion of scientific drilling programs that can access the sediment and rock record of the ocean floor are all contributing to a rapid improvement in our knowledge of the world beneath the waves. Zealandia is likely not the last geological surprise that these improving technologies will reveal. The ocean floor covers approximately 70% of the Earth's surface, and we have mapped it at the resolution needed to detect geological features comparable to the continents of Zealandia over less than a quarter of that area. The remainder is still, in the most literal sense, uncharted territory. The economic and geopolitical implications of Zealandia's formal recognition as a continent are more significant than they might initially appear, and they have begun to shape international discussions about resource rights and maritime boundaries in the southwestern Pacific. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the international legal framework that governs the use and management of the world's oceans, coastal states have the right to claim an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from their coastlines, within which they have sovereign rights over the living and non-living resources of the seabed and the water column. Beyond the exclusive economic zone, a coastal state can claim an extended continental shelf, sovereign rights over the mineral resources of the seabed, in areas where the continental shelf extends beyond the 200-mile limit, up to a maximum of 350 nautical miles from the shore or 100 nautical miles beyond the 2,500-meter depth contour, whichever is greater. The recognition of Zealandia as a continent significantly affects the extent of the continental shelf claims that can be made by New Zealand and France, the two states with territorial claims to the above-water portions of Zealandia. New Zealand's above-water territories include the main islands and numerous offshore islands, and France's territorial claim encompasses New Caledonia and several other island groups. Both countries have submitted extended continental shelf claims to the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the body that reviews and makes recommendations on such claims. These claims cover large areas of the submerged Zealandian plateau and, if accepted, would give New Zealand and France sovereign rights over the mineral resources of vast areas of the Pacific seafloor. The mineral resources potentially present on and beneath the Zealandian seafloor are not trivial. The region contains significant deposits of natural gas and oil in the sedimentary basins along its margins, manganese nodules on the deeper portions of the seafloor, and potentially significant deposits of rare earth elements and other strategic minerals in the hydrothermal vent fields associated with the active volcanic arcs and back arc basins of the region. The economic value of these resources, while difficult to quantify with precision, is potentially enormous, and the legal framework governing their exploitation is directly shaped by the scientific determination of the extent and character of the Zealandian continental crust. The environmental implications of deep-sea mining in the Zealandian region have become a significant concern as the technologies for seafloor resource extraction have matured. The unique biological communities of the Zealandian seafloor, The cold-water coral gardens, the seamount fish populations, the invertebrate communities that have evolved in isolation over millions of years, are among the most distinctive and most poorly understood marine ecosystems in the world. Mining activity in these environments could cause damage that is irreversible on any human timescale, eliminating communities that took millions of years to develop and that may contain species and ecological processes that have not yet been documented. The tension between the economic value of the resources and the conservation value of the ecosystems that contain them is one that international ocean governance is only beginning to grapple with, and the recognition of Zealandia as a continent, by drawing attention to its geographic extent and its scientific significance, has contributed to growing calls for stronger protection of the Zealandian marine environment. New Zealand has taken significant steps toward the protection of its surrounding seas, including the declaration of several large marine protected areas that prohibit fishing and other extractive activities. But the areas covered by New Zealand's current marine protections are a small fraction of the full extent of the Zealandian Plateau, and the outer portions of the continental shelf, beyond New Zealand's exclusive economic zone, are governed by a patchwork of international agreements that provide limited and inconsistent protection. The management of Zealandia's resources and ecosystems in the interest of both present and future generations is a challenge that will require sustained international cooperation and the development of governance frameworks that are still very much in the early stages of construction. The governance challenges posed by Zealandia's resources are part of a broader challenge facing ocean governance globally: the mismatch between the ecological and geological realities of the ocean and the political and legal frameworks that have been developed to manage it. The ocean is a continuous system, with currents and ecological connections that cross national boundaries, but international ocean law is organized around the territorial claims of coastal states, creating a patchwork of jurisdictions that does not always align well with the physical and ecological realities it is supposed to manage. The recognition of Zealandia as a continent, by drawing attention to the extent and complexity of the geological entity that underlies the southwestern Pacific, contributes to a growing awareness of the inadequacy of existing governance frameworks for managing the ocean's resources and ecosystems in a sustainable way. The relationship between Zealandia and the rest of the Pacific world, the islands and peoples and ecological systems that surround the submerged continent, is one that the formal recognition of Zealandia has begun to reframe, with implications for how we think about the Pacific as a whole. The Pacific Ocean covers approximately 1/3 of the Earth's surface, and the islands distributed across its vast extent, from the volcanic islands of Hawaii and Samoa and Fiji to the coral atolls of Kiribati and Tuvalu to the continental islands of New Zealand and New Caledonia, form one of the most diverse and most ecologically significant assemblages on Earth. The recognition of Zealandia as a submerged continent adds a new dimension to this picture, because it means that a significant portion of the southwestern Pacific seafloor is not oceanic in character but continental, a distinction that affects everything from the ecological communities that inhabit the seafloor to the physical oceanography of the region to the legal framework that governs the exploitation of its resources. The ecological communities of the Zealandian seafloor are richer and more diverse than those of the surrounding oceanic areas, in part because the shallower depths of the continental plateau, typically 1 to 3 kilometers, compared to 4 to 6 kilometers for the deep ocean, bring the seafloor within the range of sunlight-dependent biological processes and within reach of the terrestrial-derived nutrients that flow from the above-water portions of the continent. The seamounts and submarine ridges of the Zealandian plateau support coral reef communities, diverse fish populations, and assemblages of invertebrates that are still being documented by researchers. Many of these species are found nowhere else in the world, extending the extraordinary biological distinctiveness of the above-water New Zealand and New Caledonian fauna and flora into the submarine environment. The physical oceanography of the Zealandian region is also significantly shaped by the presence of the continental plateau. The shallow water of the plateau interacts with the deep ocean circulation of the southwestern Pacific in ways that affect the distribution of nutrients, the temperature of surface waters, and the behavior of major ocean currents. The Tasman Sea, bounded to the east by the Zealandian Plateau and to the west by the Australian continent, has its own distinctive oceanographic character, warmer and less productive than the open Pacific to the east, that is partly a consequence of its semi-enclosed status, bounded on two sides by continental masses. The East Australian Current, the southward-flowing boundary current that carries warm tropical water along the eastern coast of Australia and into the Tasman Sea, interacts with the Zealandian Plateau in complex ways that influence the marine ecosystems of both New Zealand and Australia. When the current swings eastward across the Tasman Sea and encounters the shallower waters of the Zealandian Shelf, it generates upwelling and mixing that brings cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface, supporting some of the most productive marine ecosystems in the southwestern Pacific. The commercial fisheries of New Zealand's eastern coast are substantially dependent on these oceanographic processes, which are in turn shaped by the presence of the continental plateau that makes Zealandia a distinct oceanographic entity. The future of the Zealandian marine environment in a warming world is a question that ocean scientists are actively investigating. The warming of the Tasman Sea over the past century has already had significant effects on the distribution of marine species, on the frequency and intensity of marine heat waves, and on the dynamics of the currents that supply nutrients to the Zealandian continental shelf. The coral reefs of New Zealand's subtropical Kermadec Islands, which represent the southernmost coral reefs in the Pacific, have experienced bleaching events linked to elevated water temperatures, and the cold water coral communities of the deeper Zealandian seafloor are vulnerable to the ocean acidification caused by the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Ocean acidification reduces the availability of the calcium carbonate that corals and other calcifying organisms need to build their skeletons, and it is already measurably affecting the biology of deep-sea coral communities in various parts of the world ocean. The cold water corals of the Zealandian seamounts, some of which are hundreds or thousands of years old and represent irreplaceable ecological communities, are among the organisms most vulnerable to this change, because the cold, deep waters where they live are first to become undersaturated with respect to calcium carbonate as the ocean chemistry shifts in response to atmospheric CO2. The continent beneath the Pacific is not insulated from the changes happening at the surface. Its ecosystems are connected to and dependent on the physical and chemical state of the overlying ocean, and what happens to that ocean in the coming decades and centuries will shape the future of the drowned world as surely as it shapes the future of the lands above the waves. The Zealandian marine environment is also significant as a reference point for understanding relatively undisturbed deep-sea ecosystems. Many parts of the world's deep ocean have been altered by bottom trawling, mining, and pollution before being adequately surveyed. The deeper portions of the Zealandian Plateau, protected by their remote location and limited human impact, may represent a pre-disturbance baseline for deep-sea ecosystems, communities against which more disturbed areas can be compared and toward which restoration efforts can be directed. Their preservation is not just a conservation goal, it is a scientific resource. The story of Zealandia forces a reconsideration of one of the most basic frameworks we use for thinking about the geography of the Earth, the distinction between continent and ocean that has been the foundation of geographical education for centuries. Every schoolchild learns the 7 continents: Africa, Antarctica, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and South America. This list is presented as a fact about the world, as a description of the physical reality of the Earth's surface. But the 7-continent framework is, in fact, a historical and cultural construction, and it is not the only possible way to divide the world's landmasses. The 2-continent framework, which divides the world's land into the Old World and the New World, was the dominant geographical framework in Europe until the 16th century. The 4-continent framework, which combines Europe and Asia into Eurasia, often with Africa attached as part of a single Old World landmass, is widely used in geographical and geological contexts. Some geographers recognize 6 continents, combining North and South America into a single landmass called the Americas. Others recognize 5. The definition of what counts as a continent is not established by any single authoritative international body. Geographers, geologists, and cultural historians use different criteria. Some prioritize the continuous land area, others the geological character of the crust, others the cultural and historical traditions of the regions in question. By the geological criteria that Mortimer and colleagues applied to Zealandia, discrete continental crust, elevated above the surrounding ocean floor, with a distinctive geological history, the case for Zealandia as a continent is compelling. By the cultural and geographical criteria that most people use when they talk about continents, large, above-water landmasses with their own distinct biogeography, cultural history, and political geography, Zealandia is problematic because 94% of it is underwater. The tension between these different frameworks is not merely semantic. It reflects a deeper tension in how we think about the relationship between the physical world and the conceptual categories we use to organize it. The physical world does not divide itself neatly into continents and oceans. The transition between continental and oceanic crust is gradual in many places. The sea level that determines what is land and what is ocean has varied enormously over geological time, and the categories themselves are products of human observation and conceptualization rather than discoveries of mind-independent facts. Zealandia, by being mostly underwater, makes this tension visible in a particularly acute way. It is a continent that most people will never see, that contributes no territory to any of the world's nations except through its above-water peaks, and that exists as a geographical entity primarily in the minds and the data sets of geologists. And yet it is there, beneath the Pacific, as real as any of the 7 continents that every schoolchild can name. The recognition of Zealandia also invites reflection on the other pieces of submerged continental crust that exist around the world and that might, under a sufficiently systematic analysis, qualify for similar recognition. The Kerguelen Plateau in the southern Indian Ocean is a large piece of continental or transitional crust that has been discussed in the context of potential continental status. The Jan Mayen microcontinent in the North Atlantic, the Seychelles microcontinent in the Indian Ocean, and numerous other submerged geological entities share some of the characteristics that qualified Zealandia for continental recognition. Whether any of them will be formally reclassified as continents, and how the geological community will handle the proliferation of continental claims that a liberal application of the Zealandian criteria might produce, are questions that the earth sciences community has not yet fully resolved. The broader implication is that the number of continents is not a fixed and settled fact about the world. It is a classification that depends on the criteria we apply and on the resolution at which we are prepared to distinguish continental from non-continental crust. The 7-continent model that most people learned in school is a simplification of a more complex geological reality, and the formal recognition of Zealandia has made that complexity more visible. Future mapping and analysis of the world's ocean floors may reveal other geological entities that complicate the picture further, and the conceptual framework of what counts as a continent will continue to evolve as our understanding of the solid Earth deepens. The question of what counts as a continent is ultimately a question about the purposes we want the concept to serve. If the concept is to be useful for teaching children about the geography of the Earth, then it should refer to recognizable above-water landmasses that can be shown on a globe. If the concept is to be useful for geological classification, then it should refer to discrete pieces of continental crust regardless of whether they are above or below sea level. If the concept is to be useful for international law, then it should be defined in terms relevant to the legal framework. The definition used by UNCLOS for the purposes of continental shelf claims is different from the geological definition used by Mortimer and colleagues. Zealandia does not fit neatly into any of these different purposes, and its recognition has exposed the extent to which the word continent serves multiple masters at once. The future of Zealandia research is one of the most exciting frontiers in the earth sciences, because the submerged continent preserves geological archives that are inaccessible in the above-water portions and that have the potential to answer some of the most important questions about the evolution of the southwestern Pacific. The sediment record of the Zealandian seafloor is an archive of extraordinary depth and completeness. Unlike the geological record on land, which is subject to erosion, deformation, and the disruption of tectonic activity, the sediment accumulating on the floor of the Zealandian seas has been building up continuously for tens of millions of years, layer by layer, preserving in each layer a snapshot of the conditions at the time of deposition. Reading that archive, extracting sediment cores, dating their layers, and analyzing their chemical and biological content will allow researchers to reconstruct the environmental and geological history of the region with a temporal resolution and a completeness that no other type of evidence can provide. The scientific drilling programs that have begun to access this archive, using research vessels equipped with long drill strings that can penetrate hundreds of meters into the seafloor sediment, have already produced significant results. Core samples from the Zealandian seafloor have been used to reconstruct the history of sea level change in the region, to document the record of major volcanic events and their effects on the local marine environment, and to trace the history of the biological communities that have inhabited the region since the continent submerged. Future drilling programs, targeting the deepest and oldest portions of the sediment record in the basins of the Zealandian plateau, will extend this record further back in time and will allow the reconstruction of the environmental conditions during the critical periods of the continent's geological history: the initial submergence, the period of maximum depth, and the partial re-emergence that produced the modern New Zealand archipelago. The rock samples dredged from the exposed scarps and ridges of the submerged plateau are another crucial source of information. Unlike the sediment record, which tells us about the marine environment, the dredged rocks tell us about the continental crust itself, its composition, its age, its thermal history, and the tectonic processes that have shaped it. The systematic dredging of the Zealandian plateau, covering the full extent of the submerged continental crust, will provide a geochemical map of the continent that can be used to test models of its formation and evolution and to identify the portions of the crust that are most likely to have been above water for the longest periods, and therefore most likely to have supported the biological communities whose evolutionary history we want to reconstruct. The scientific value of the Zealandian research program extends well beyond the specific questions it is designed to answer. The techniques developed for studying submerged continental crust in the Zealandian context, the sediment coring methods, the geophysical survey approaches, the integration of geological and biological data, are directly applicable to the study of other submerged geological entities around the world. The scientific infrastructure being developed for Zealandian research is, in this sense, an investment in our capacity to understand the full geological history of the Earth, not just the history of one particular drowned continent. The sediment archives, the rock collections, the geophysical datasets, and the biological surveys being built up through Zealandian research programs are not just resources for answering the specific questions of Zealandian science. They are contributions to the global knowledge infrastructure that supports the full range of Earth system science, from understanding past climate change to managing ocean resources to assessing the geological hazards that threaten coastal populations around the Pacific. The international collaboration that characterizes Zealandian research also represents a model for how the earth sciences can address questions that exceed the capacity of any single national research community. The geological mapping of Zealandia requires research vessels, deep-sea drilling programs, and analytical facilities that no single country can maintain alone. The collaboration between New Zealand, Australia, France, and other international partners in Zealandian research has produced results that none of these partners could have achieved independently, and it demonstrates the value of sustained international cooperation in the earth sciences at a time when the global scientific community is facing challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, the management of ocean resources, that similarly exceed the capacity of any single national program to address alone. The specific contribution that Zealandian research makes to global earth science is also worth emphasizing. The geological history of Zealandia, the rifting from Gondwana, the submergence, the partial re-emergence driven by a new plate collision, is a sequence of geological events that is well documented enough to serve as a test case for models of continental rifting and subsidence that are applied in many other geological contexts. The petroleum industry, which needs to understand the geological history of submerged continental shelves to locate oil and gas deposits, draws directly on the results of Zealandian research when building models of similar geological settings elsewhere. The insights gained from studying Zealandia's drowned landscape contribute to the practical application of geology in ways that extend far beyond the southwestern Pacific. The story of Zealandia is, at one level, a story about a specific piece of geology in a specific part of the Pacific Ocean. But at a deeper level, it is a story about the nature of scientific knowledge and the surprising incompleteness of our understanding of the world we inhabit. We have been mapping the Earth's surface for centuries. The age of exploration that began in the 15th century and continued through the 19th sent ships to every ocean, recorded the position of every coastline, and produced the remarkably accurate world maps that we recognize as essentially correct today. The satellite era of the 20th and 21st centuries has given us imagery of every square meter of the land surface, repeated at intervals of days, with enough resolution to distinguish individual trees or cars. We have mapped the ocean floor with sonar, identified the mid-ocean ridges and the deep trenches, traced the plate boundaries that determine the large-scale structure of the ocean basins. We understand, at a broad level, the major features of the Earth's geography. And yet we missed an entire continent for the best part of 2 centuries of systematic scientific study of the ocean floor. Not because the evidence was not there. The rocks were there, the bathymetry was there, the seismic data was there. But because the conceptual framework for interpreting that evidence did not have a category for what the evidence was pointing to, and because the evidence was distributed across a large area and across multiple scientific disciplines in ways that prevented any single researcher from seeing the whole picture. The recognition of Zealandia is a reminder that the map of the world, even in the 21st century, contains blank spaces, not the terra incognita of the pre-modern cartographers, but conceptual blank spaces, areas where the evidence has been collected but has not yet been interpreted in ways that reveal its full significance. Those blank spaces are not limited to the ocean floor. They exist in our understanding of the deep interior of the Earth, in the microbiological communities that inhabit the extreme environments of the ocean floor and the deep subsurface, in the inventory of the world's biodiversity, and in our understanding of the complex systems, atmospheric, oceanic, geological, biological, that together constitute the Earth system. The recognition of Zealandia tells us that the era of discovery is not over, that the world contains surprises on a scale that we do not yet fully appreciate, and that the most important discoveries of the coming centuries may be waiting in places we have already surveyed, in evidence we have already collected, in data we have already gathered but not yet fully understood. The history of the planet recorded in the rocks and sediments of Zealandia is a history that spans nearly all of geological time. The oldest rocks exposed in New Zealand, the metamorphic and igneous rocks of the Fiordland region in the South Island, are over 500 million years old, representing geological processes from the early Paleozoic era, long before the first vertebrates had evolved. The youngest geological features, the active volcanoes of the North Island, the earthquakes that shake the entire country on a regular basis, the ongoing uplift of the Southern Alps, are happening now, in the present, as the same tectonic forces that have shaped the region for hundreds of millions of years continue to operate. The geological history of Zealandia encompasses nearly the full range of Earth's history, from the ancient metamorphic basement of the continent's core to the volcanic rocks erupting today from the calderas of the Taupo volcanic zone. It is, in this sense, not merely a continent but a geological library, a physical record of the Earth's history written in the rocks and sediments of a landmass that has witnessed the entire Phanerozoic history of life. The accessibility of that record, through the geological outcrops of the New Zealand mountains, through the sediment cores and dredge samples of the surrounding seafloor, through the fossil collections of the country's natural history museums, makes Zealandia one of the most scientifically valuable geological entities in the world. The research programs that are currently active across the continent are producing results at a rate that is accelerating, as new technologies improve the resolution and the depth of the geological record that can be accessed. The drowned continent is, in the most literal sense, an archive, a physical record of the history of a piece of the Earth's surface across geological time, and the scientists who study it are archivists, reading the record that the rocks and sediments and organisms of Zealandia have been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years. The timescales involved in that record are difficult to hold in mind, but they are the timescales on which the Earth operates. The oldest rocks exposed in New Zealand are older than the first fish with jaws. The separation of Zealandia from Australia occurred before the first grasses had evolved. The period of maximum submergence coincides with the early evolution of the primate lineage to which human beings belong. The re-emergence of the New Zealand landmass above sea level occurred roughly at the same time as the ancestors of the modern horse were still the size of dogs. The Zealandian Geological Archive covers all of this history, from the deep Paleozoic to the present, in the rocks and sediments of a continent that has been in continuous evolution throughout the entire span of complex animal life on Earth. The drowned landscape of Zealandia invites a particular kind of imaginative engagement, the attempt to visualize what the continent looked like when it was above the ocean, to populate its vanished valleys and plains with the life that once inhabited them, to hear the rivers that once ran to the sea across a land that is now the floor of the Pacific. The geology and paleontology of the above-water remnants of Zealandia provide some clues. The rocks of the New Zealand South Island include ancient metamorphic terrains, packages of highly deformed and metamorphosed rock that record a long and complex geological history reaching back hundreds of millions of years. They also include the sedimentary rocks that were deposited in the shallow seas that covered parts of the region in various geological periods, and these rocks contain the fossils, the shells of marine invertebrates, the bones of ancient whales and other marine vertebrates, the pollen and spores of ancient plants, that allow partial reconstruction of what the region was like in those past periods. The Oligocene epoch, the period of maximum submergence, approximately 23 to 34 million years ago, is particularly interesting for the question of what the above-water remnants of Zealandia looked like. If the complete submergence hypothesis is correct and all of present-day New Zealand was beneath the ocean at this time, then the geological and biological record should show a transition from terrestrial to entirely marine conditions. If the partial submergence hypothesis is correct, there should be evidence of continuing terrestrial environments during this period. The evidence from the sedimentary rocks and the biological record is ambiguous enough that both interpretations have their defenders, and the resolution of the debate will require the kind of detailed geological mapping and dating that is still in progress. What is certain is that the land that exists today in New Zealand and New Caledonia represents only the highest portions of a much larger continental landmass, a landmass that was, for much of its existence, a substantial above-water entity with its own rivers, forests, mountains, and fauna. The loss of that landmass, the slow submergence that reduced a continent to a scattering of islands and a vast underwater plateau, is one of the most dramatic episodes in the geological history of the Pacific. The world that was lost was a real world, as real as the world that replaced it, and the traces it left in the rocks and the organisms and the seafloor topography of the Zealandian region are the only record we have of what was there before the ocean covered it. The New Zealand landscape that exists today, with its extraordinary alpine scenery, its dramatic coastlines, its ancient forests and distinctive wildlife, is, in a very real sense, the summit of a drowned continent. When you stand on the southern Alps and look west toward the Tasman Sea, you are standing on the highest peaks of a mountain range that once rose above a much larger landmass, surrounded by lowlands and valleys that are now beneath the ocean. The sea that you see in the distance is not a distant, separate world. It is the surface of the water that covers most of your continent, the continuation of the landmass on which you stand, pushed below the waves by the same geological forces that raised the mountains above you. The imagination required to see Zealandia whole, to visualize the drowned continent as a geographical entity rather than just as a piece of oceanic seafloor, is exactly the imagination that geological science requires. The ability to see through time as well as through space, to recognize the present as a moment in a process that extends far back into the past and will continue far forward into the future. The continent that is mostly hidden beneath the Pacific was once above the waves, and the geological forces that are currently raising the New Zealand mountains suggest that more of it may eventually emerge again, on timescales that dwarf human history. The continent is not static. It is, like all of Earth's surface, in motion, responding to the forces that drive plate tectonics, eroding and accumulating, rising and sinking, in the continuous geological process that has been shaping the Earth's surface since the planet formed 4.5 billion years ago. Standing at the edge of the sea in New Zealand, watching the waves break against the cliffs of drowned Zealandia, it is possible to appreciate in a visceral way what the geological record tells us intellectually. That the boundary between land and sea is not fixed, that it has moved dramatically over geological time and will move again, and that the specific configuration of land and ocean that we inhabit is one of countless configurations that the Earth's surface has assumed over its 4-billion-year history. The ocean that covers the submerged continent is not a permanent feature of the world. It is a temporary occupant of a surface that has been land and will, in some geological future, be land again. The continent beneath the Pacific is patient. It has been waiting for 85 million years. It can wait a little longer. The continent beneath the Pacific has been there for 85 million years. It has been submerged for most of that time. It has been studied by geologists for over a century. And it has been formally recognized as a continent for less than a decade. That sequence of geological reality, long existence, scientific study, and belated recognition is a parable about the relationship between evidence and understanding, between what is real and what is known, between the world and the map we make of it. Zealandia was always there. The rocks were always there. The evidence was always accumulating in the cores and the dredge samples and the seismic profiles. What changed in 2017 was not the world, it was the conceptual framework through which the world was being seen. The continent emerged, not from the ocean, but from the accumulated weight of evidence that had been pointing toward it for decades, waiting for someone to put it all together and say, this is a continent, and here is the argument for why. The history of science is full of similar moments. Moments when what was already known was assembled into a new understanding that made the world look different without any single new observation having been made. Darwin's theory of natural selection drew on observations that naturalists had been making for centuries. Einstein's special theory of relativity drew on experimental results and theoretical puzzles that had been accumulating for decades. The plate tectonics revolution drew on decades of ocean floor mapping and paleomagnetic data that had been collected without a framework for interpreting it. In each case, the world was the same before and after the insight. What changed was the conceptual structure through which the evidence was seen. Zealandia is smaller than those revolutions. It is a geographical reclassification rather than a fundamental change in our understanding of the laws of nature. But it carries the same lesson in miniature. The world contains more than our current categories can accommodate, and the discoveries that await us are not always hidden in places we have not yet explored. Sometimes they are hiding in plain sight, in the data we have already collected, in the evidence we have already gathered, waiting for the moment when someone assembles it into a new picture and the hidden thing becomes visible. There is a continent under the Pacific. There was always a continent under the Pacific. We just had to learn to see it. The continent beneath the Pacific will remain largely invisible to most people who live above it. Tourists in New Zealand are standing, without knowing it, on the highest peaks of a drowned continent. Fishing boats working the Chatham Rise are working over the submerged continental shelf of Zealandia, in waters whose depth and productivity are a direct consequence of the continental crust beneath them. Sailors crossing the Tasman Sea are crossing between two portions of what was once a single Gondwanan landmass, a fact that the deep water between them conceals. These invisible connections, the geological continuities beneath the visible geography, are one of the things that the recognition of Zealandia makes available as a way of thinking about the world. The planet is older and stranger than the surface we walk on. The landmasses we inhabit are fragments of an ancient whole. The ocean that separates us from our nearest neighbors is a temporary feature of processes that were different in the past and will be different in the future. Zealandia, the drowned continent, is a reminder that the world we live on is in motion, and that the full story of the surface we inhabit extends far deeper in time and water than the experience of standing on solid ground can suggest. The drowned world of Zealandia is a world that no human being has ever seen. No person has walked its submerged plains or stood on the banks of the rivers that once ran across its now flooded lowlands. No human culture has a memory of the continent as a whole, of the full extent of the land that once lay where the ocean now covers it. The Maori tradition preserves the memory of islands drawn up from the sea, and the geology confirms that the above-water peaks of New Zealand are indeed the remnants of a submerged continent, but no one has ever seen the whole of Zealandia above the waves. It existed for tens of millions of years, in a world before human beings existed, and it sank long before the first human footprint was made anywhere on Earth. What we know of it comes from the indirect evidence of the rocks and the sediments and the organisms that survive into the present, a reconstruction of a lost world assembled from fragmentary evidence. That reconstruction is incomplete and will remain so. But what we have is enough to know that the continent was there, that it was a real place with a real history, and that its legacy, in the rocks of New Zealand, in the ancient organisms that survived its submergence, in the ocean floor topography that preserves the memory of its former surface, is one of the most remarkable geological inheritances on Earth. The continent is gone, in the sense that matters for human habitation. But it is still there, in the sense that matters for science. And every year, as the research programs mapping the Zealandian seafloor add another piece, the picture of a world that was hidden grows a little clearer. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more continents in the data, more worlds in the evidence we have already gathered, more moments when what we thought we knew turns out to be incomplete in ways that matter. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect.